So we've been talking about batteries. We talked about chargers. We talked about inverters, inverter chargers. And we also brought about alternators. So now what we're going to talk about is an external regulator. We're not going to spend crazy amount of time, but I do want to bring up the concept of an external regulator. External regulators are devices that convert an alternator to be smart, ultimately. It's putting a brain on an alternator. Internal regulators that we talked about a little bit earlier are overly cautious, and they're not going to give you as high an output as a charge rate. External regulators, to give you an example, are stock item on a Tierra boat. Why would Tierra put external regulators on their alternators? Actually, Tierras have a lot in common with sailboats. They're going, and they're not running their engines for a long time. If you've got a Tierra and you're cruising at 25 knots, 30 knots, you're not going to be doing 2-3 hours a day. I mean, you're going to be going around Vancouver Island. I mean, 90 nautical miles is, you got 60 nautical miles between Sydney and Nanaimo, not even 45 maybe. I mean, you're not going to be running your Tierra, Nanaimo, Sydney to Vancouver, Vancouver back to Nanaimo. You're running that boat for maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, maybe an hour and a half, maybe.
That's all you can afford.
Well, you know, that's why they have a Tierra. But the point is that even power boats will have external regulators. And I also see a lot of boaters, when we design projects for other boaters, we're saying, well, how about putting an external regulator on your trawler if you don't have a generator and you need to create power, not only to offload the loads that are running on your boat when you're underway, but to really make a lot of gains, because some boaters are maybe running their boats for 3-4 hours a day as they're going up north. And within that 3-4 hours, as they're going in Alaska every day of running the boat, or 5 hours, they want to do everything they can to bring their batteries back up so that they can run their boat overnight for 1 day or 2 and then go on again. So that purpose of an external regulator is to make your alternator better, really. So it's a little crazy, I know. I was trying, oh my God, how am I going to put that in? But whoever came up with this device must have been so proud of themselves, because it is a perfect device. In terms of what it does, it's sort of the dream. It will miraculously offset, and it turns your alternator into this incredibly sophisticated device. It's going to offset voltage drop, which is a really big deal. Voltage drop is a really big deal. On some boats, you could be losing 20-30% because a lot of people have undersized wiring between their alternator and their batteries. But generally, you should be at least 10. But they'll actually offset the 10 or even more of the voltage drop, which is kind of amazing. They're going to be temperature compensated for the batteries. They're going to actually tell you when the alternator is getting too hot. It's actually going to be looking at alternator temperature. And alternators die because they get too hot because they're working so hard. It's actually going to pull back. And it's going to say, you know what, I know you want me to work out at 100 amps, but right now the alternator is too hot. I'm going to pull back the output, and I'm going to let the alternator cool off. So they're actually going to change or adjust the output of the alternator. So you're basically got a device that converts alternator output and makes it smart, right? That's basically what it does. You also have a device that can actually be configured for the type of battery that you have. So not only, when you think about an internal regulator, it assumes that you have flooded lead acid battery. It thinks that your batteries are just vanilla. There's just nothing special about them. But when you have an external regulator, you can actually dial in and say, I want my charge profile to say bulk, I want to stop at 14.4, 14.6. I want to have absorption timer to be so much, and I want my flow voltage. You can totally geek out with an external regulator. You have complete control. So that's really good. And the temperature compensated charging is also very important. By the way, these devices are not crazy expensive. You know, in Canadian dollars, you're looking $500-700 for these devices, about in the range. So it's not completely inaccessible. And again, for sailboaters, really popular, because ideally you want to sail motor out of an anchorage and maybe motor into an anchorage. And for some boaters, what I see is maybe they'll run at the alternator an hour out, an hour in, or half an hour out, half an hour in. And then within that 1 hour window of running their engine, they'll do everything they need to recharge their battery to stay in overnight. So here's an example of a Serpentine kit that comes with a high output alternator where you can actually convert an alternator that's made for Vbelt. Vbelts are really, I mean, I know we have them all on our boats, most of us, but they're not a great way of transmitting the rotational energy of the engine to the alternator. And so just this week alone, I did 3 projects where we actually converted alternators to Serpentine belts. So it's a very popular item for boaters that don't have a generator and want to have more done from their alternator.
You said that's about $800?
Yeah, Serpentine kit Canadian is about 800, 700 depending, but it's not bad at all. So here's an example of a retrofit. And the company that does it is actually Canadian, it's Electromax. They have something over 300 kits already. All Yanmar engines, Universal, I mean, they have 300 conversion kits that are actually created pretty much for every engine that is out there. And so you actually simply bolt them back on. Like you don't have, it's not complicated, it's do yourself. Like we're doing a Catalina 50 where I think it took about a couple hours to put the kit on. Like it's not too time consuming. Some of them are more involved than others, but it can be pretty straightforward.
What's the name of the outfit?
Electromax out of Toronto. They're great.
And from a field maintenance perspective on your belts and everything, is it?
Oh, this is the dream. Yeah, the question is the serviceability or the maintenance of the V-belt. If you don't have a spare V-belt on your boat, you are simply not aware of how quickly your V-belt will fail. So if you have a V-belt on your boat that is moving your alternator and your water pump, you must black and white carry a spare with you. Okay? First of all, they're all different widths, all different lengths. You're not going to go into the middle of nowhere and give a specification of what you need and expect them to have them. Like in a big city, no problem. Vancouver, Victoria, Nanaimo, all those places, sure. But as soon as you're going up, don't think you're going to go to, for example, an island in Desolation Sound and go, oh yeah, you've got that V-belt for me because I'm looking for so-and-so. Like, it's not going to happen. So carry V-belt spares or spare V-belts. Now with a Serpentine, you're basically, it's never going to go. Like, never. To the point that we recommend a spare because I'm always thinking safety factor, but you'll never use it. The amount of energy transfer on a Serpentine belt, you look at the surface area, because that's what it is, right? Is way more than a V-belt. Multiples of. So they just don't slip. And the slippage is what causes wear, right? It's that glazing effect. I'm not a mechanic, but a boater, right? We can all relate. And they talk about the belt being shiny, right? That shiny belt is a belt that has been glazed, and that slippage, as we know, heat's never good for anything. And to begin with, an alternator lives in a hospitable place. So more heat is worse, right? So way better for serviceability. And also, we talked about that too, like if you're going to change, and this is incredibly important, okay? This is another kind of huge takeaway. Rule number 1, nothing's easy. Perfect. Let's always go back to rule number 1. If you change your alternator to an external regulator, if you had a 55 amp alternator, 120 amp alternator, you never got 120 amp out of that alternator ever. And the builder of your engine knew that. So for example, a stock 55 amp alternator is generally daisy chained to the starter solenoid post with a 10 gauge wire rated for only 30 amps. So think about it. The manufacturer used a 30 amp wire, gauge 10, between the alternator and the starter post. That's it, tiny, 10 gauges, smaller than a pencil. Now, you're taking that 55 amp and you decide to make an external regulator on it. It's going to give you more than it ever did. That wire is most likely now undersized. And remember that slide we were showing about old versus new on the alternators? Guess why we go to new a lot? Well, if I'm going to change the wire between the starter post and the alternator, I might as well just run a new wire to the battery that I want to connect. And that's sort of the genesis to doing it right. Like if you're going to start the journey, and I see do this on my boat all the time, I'm like, oh, I'm doing this. Oh, well, while I'm doing that, I might as well do this. Oh, well, I'm doing that. And the project starts with like 8 hours, and I'm like 40 hours in, and I'm like, well, now I can't not do it. That would be one of the low-hanging fruit is if you're going to rechange the wire, which is probably undersized to begin with, on your alternator, you might as well run it to where it should go. It might be, in your case, to your engine battery, or it might go to your house battery. There's pros and cons, and it's a dilemma. You have to make a decision, but make sure you don't assume that the alternator wiring is sufficiently sized to handle any size alternator you're going to throw on that engine. I've seen the wires burnt, like I'm talking like a cigarette, like literally the jacket of the wire is melted back, not like 1 inch, but 4 or 5 inches. That's how hot the wire got, that the jacket actually got cinched back. So very important that when you change your alternator or you make your alternator better by putting an external regulator, you also think, oh my God, I should look at the wiring. Can the wiring handle all this new power? Other thing, funny fact, if your alternator has a negative return lead, which some of them do because there's a negative post on the alternator, my previous owner thought that electricity was really more of a ground as a reference point, and somehow electricity traveled just on the positive wire. Not joking. And by the way, an engineer, no joke, decided that for him, he thought that connectivity was going to only happen on the red wire, and all the negatives never had to be big because they were more like a common reference point. So my alternator, when I got my boat, was a 120 amp alternator, had a great positive wire. It was gauged, he went all out, 1/0, perfect. Voltage drop was like negligible, like it was like basically like the alternator was on top of the battery. The return path was a gauge 10 wire. Because in his mind, the ground was a reference point. He thought it was a chassis ground. He thought it was somehow to keep everything common. He didn't realize that when we talk about electricity, we're talking about circuits. Circuit means goes one way, it's got to come back. So the path, the return path has to be equal to the path going to the device. Very important.
But it was his engine.
Well, no, that engine was also, no, it's different because the engine battery was connected to on one and the house was on another one. He actually did a custom job. It was amazing. Yeah. Okay, so basically that's a little bit of a recap. Any questions on Serpentine, not Serpentine, external regulators?
Can you put an external regulator on a conventional?
Absolutely, we do that all the time. Question was, can we install or modify an existing alternator with an internal regulator and have that internal regulator on an existing alternator modified for an external regulator? And the answer is yes. What you do is about $50. You bring it to an alternator shop. Maybe some will charge you $75. But here in the city, it's about $50. And then what happens is they give you a wire. And that wire that you connect to is called the field wire. The field wire is what drives the alternator. And the output, the field wire that drives that alternator, is that blue wire right here. That's basically like you actually putting your foot on the actuator on your car, right? That's what actually is driving the alternator to go full field is a term, or pull back when the batteries are sufficiently charged. Any other questions on external regulators? Yes, go ahead, in the back.
Not regulators, but like say for this fellow here that's got a small diesel with a Vbelt, is it going to be beneficial for an application like that to go with Serpentine? And is the Serpentine, does it give you more, is it going to take away more horsepower?
Yeah, so the question, good question, does a Serpentine belt reduce the horsepower demand that an alternator, when it's excited, load up on the engine? And the answer is no, it does not change the horsepower. What it does change is when you think about, and this is a big challenge, when you're loading up a large alternator on an engine, as you're adjusting and tightening the V-belt, right, that's actually hard, especially not on the crankshaft pulley, that's fine. The water pump in the front of the engine, as you're side loading that, there's so much tension that you can put on that before it actually becomes too hard. The good thing about a Serpentine is because you don't need that separation to create a good contact, you're going to effectively less side load the water pump. There is no doubt, besides money, and the ability to put one on your boat, that everybody wants a Serpentine kit. That's just, everybody wants one. Sort of like an isolation transformer. It's not like the jury's out on if it's a good idea or not. Everybody wants one. It's a question, can you fit one in? And do you have, in terms of your priority list on your boat, is it enough of a priority to do it financially? But if one was given to you or offered to be installed on your boat, no one would say, well, you know what, actually, I'm going to stick with a Vbelt. Nobody would say that. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Should you put that external regulator in the engine room or outside?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Question was, where should the external regulator be mounted? Should it be inside the engine room or outside of the engine room? The leads from the external regulator are not that long. So in an ideal world, you would have it outside of the engine room. Especially on sailboats, those little tiny little engine rooms get smoking hot, like crazy, like insane, right? They're off the wall hot. So how do you mount an external regulator near an alternator and you only have about 4, 5, 6 feet of cabling and not have it in the engine room and then have the cover on but not in? So ideally, yes, it's better. But that being said, you know what? Realistically, they're made to handle a lot of heat. Like I see them a lot in an engine room on sailboats. Powerboats, it's easier, right? The bigger the engine room, the less heat there is, right? But in a sailboat, it gets pretty warm. There's not a lot of airflow in a sailboat engine room. Well, engine room is a way misnomer here. If you have a sailboat and you have an engine room, congratulations. Congratulations. Financially, you've done a few wise decisions in your lifetime. Okay. But yeah, so in an ideal world, yes, but practically often you'll find them in the engine room themselves. Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of gotchas with external regulator. I just want to say I could spend an hour talking to you on the problems that I've encountered seeing external regulators miswired on boat, or people, again, not reading the manual and foregoing like 90% of the benefits and being proud of themselves and thinking, oh, I did so great here. Like, it's amazing. And look, I didn't even use a manual and look how good I'm doing. And I'm like, you defeated the whole purpose of this incredible device. If I met the inventor, I'd be high-fiving him. We'd be hugging it out. I'd be like, wow, that was genius. So smart. And they're like, oh, is that what it does? I'm like, yeah, you spent all that money and you're foregoing all the benefits. If you're going to choose to put an external regulator on your boat, please take the time to read the instructions. Even if you're going to delegate the task to someone else, make sure that person is the type of person who cares about doing things right, as opposed to just telling you what you want to hear and doing it quickly. Okay? Because you will forego all of the benefits. And I've seen also misinstalls where the batteries literally, like, massive damage can happen if it's not installed properly. If it's installed properly, it will be heaven. But if you don't, it's going to give you a lot of grief. Any questions on external regulators?
Do you have any recommendations of popular or reliable ones?
Yeah, Electromax, Balmar would be the two main ones. There used to be, Xantrex used to make one, but I don't think they do anymore. And Balmar and Electromax are, I think, the two biggest players. Anybody else have any other recommendations? I don't think there really is. Those are two big players.
Those brands are good with lithium ion as well?
Oh, yeah. The problem with, you know what, we're not going to go. That's a can of worms. That could be a whole day on lithium ion. Lessons learned from lithium ion installations. Yes, you can custom profile, but the problem is not the external regulator, it's the alternator. Because the alternator is going to work. Imagine it's like feeding a Kodiak bear. Like, you can't feed it enough fish to quench its desire to have current. Like, they are endless. So the alternators burn out. You need a really strong, beefy alternator to feed a lithium phosphate battery bank. Otherwise, they just simply, the limiting factor is not the battery anymore. The limiting factor, the weak point, is the alternator. So you need a really amazing alternator when you do a lithium iron phosphate battery.
Ideally not run an alternator at all.
Well, you can, but you gotta I just saying is like, nothing is cookie cutter. What I'm saying is, go back to rule one. Rule one is nothing is ever easy. Always back to that rule. And with lithium, if you don't do that rule, you're just gonna be in a world of hurt. World of hurt. Okay, any other questions on external regulators?
Do they have pinouts for data? Because you can nerd out on gauges.
Say that again?
Do they have
pinouts for data? Because you can write out on gauges.
Yeah, actually, there's the Electromax actually has the ability actually to be going to a computer. They'll do pinout for gauges, like for example, Balmar will actually intercept the TAC output to know if the alternator is actually working, which is silly, but it's possible that your regulator might say, well, I don't need to work because the batteries are sufficiently charged. And then if you enable the mode to say, well, you know what, even though you don't need to, I want you to work so that I can actually get my TAC output. That's a feature that Balmar has. But this is we're geeking out right now, right? Like, see people glazing over. It's like, whoa, too much information here, Jeff. Like, let's not go too crazy, okay? If you want to talk about, I could literally talk an hour about just this device, and I'm not done. We're starting. Like, we're just, okay? It's a neat device. Ultimately, external regulator, think, I want to have my alternator recharge my batteries faster. That's ultimately the purpose, okay?